He mocked her in German, certain she couldn't understand, until she answered back and shattered his ego. The smell of roasted coffee beans drifted through the air, mixing with the faint clatter of cups and low chatter of early morning customers. It was one of those days where time seemed to move faster than your hands could keep up. Behind the counter, Danielle Rhodes moved from table to table, jotting orders on her notepad, balancing a tray of steaming cappuccinos with one hand and refilling sugar jars with the other. She'd been on her feet since before sunrise, her second shift of the week, and it was only Tuesday. She didn't notice him at first. Most people didn't expect to see a billionaire in a place like this, a small, family-run cafe tucked between a pharmacy and a laundromat on 9th Street in downtown Phoenix. Jonas Wexler wasn't the type to blend in. His suit looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. The watch on his wrist was worth more than Danielle's car, and the way he scanned the room said he wasn't here to linger. His assistant trailed behind, already on the phone, speaking rapidly in German. Jonas chose a seat by the window, where sunlight spilled across the table like a spotlight. He didn't order right away. Instead, he tapped something on his phone, then leaned back, clearly waiting for someone. The cafe wasn't fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and the kind of place where regulars knew the staff by name. Jonas, though, looked like someone who never learned anyone's name unless it could help him close a deal. Danielle approached with her usual smile, the one that didn't show how exhausted she was. "Good morning," she said, pen ready. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" Jonas glanced up at her, then back at his phone. "Still water, room temperature, and make sure it's bottled." It wasn't a rude request, but the way he said it made her feel like she'd been given an order, not a choice. She brought his water a few moments later, placing it carefully in front of him. His assistant returned to the table, speaking in German again, her voice lowered but firm. Danielle didn't understand every word. Not yet. But she caught pieces of it. Words that made her glance over her shoulder, words she had heard before when she lived overseas. Then the door swung open, and a tall man in a navy suit stepped inside. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, and walked like he was used to having people move out of his way. Jonas stood up to greet him, switching instantly into German. The two men shook hands, sat down, and lowered their voices. Though not enough. Danielle wasn't eavesdropping, not exactly. But in a cafe, sound carries. She caught bits and pieces, just enough to feel something shift in the air, and then she heard it. A comment about the waitress, in a tone that didn't need translation. His words rolled off his tongue quickly, with a mocking chuckle, but Danielle understood them perfectly. She had spent 3 years in Berlin, studying and working part-time before returning to the States. Her German was fluent. The insult wasn't about her service. It was about her, about the way she looked. Her pen hovered over her order pad, but she didn't write anything down. Instead, she looked at Jonas, really looked at him, and made a choice. But Jonas had no idea the woman standing in front of him could respond in the same language he thought was his shield. The cafe wasn't the kind of place anyone expected to see on a travel blog. No neon signs or glossy menu covers, just mismatched chairs, a long wooden counter polished from years of elbows leaning against it, and a chalkboard listing daily specials in looping handwriting. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pastries cooling in the back, and sunlight filtered in through the large front window, catching the tiny flecks of dust drifting lazily in the air. It was busy enough to keep Danielle moving, but not chaotic. Most of the customers were locals, the kind who knew exactly what they wanted and didn't need a menu. An older couple shared a blueberry muffin at the corner table, heads bent together over a crossword puzzle. 2 college students sat near the back, typing furiously on laptops, headphones plugged in. A man in a construction uniform grabbed a coffee to go, nodding at Danielle in silent thanks before disappearing out the door. Jonas didn't fit here, not just because of the suit, but because of the way he held himself. There was a sharpness to his presence, like someone who was constantly measuring the worth of a situation before deciding how much of his attention it deserved. His companion, the older man who had just joined him, seemed more at ease but still carried that same polished confidence. From behind the counter, Danielle poured another coffee, watching Jonas and his companion over the rim of the glass pot. They weren't trying to hide their conversation. At least, not from anyone they assumed wouldn't understand it. She caught a few more words in German, some business terms she vaguely recognized, others she knew too well. It wasn't just idle talk. They were discussing contracts, money transfers, and names she'd never heard before but could tell were important. She made her way over to their table again. Are you ready to order? She asked, setting down two menus. Jonas didn't take his eyes off the older man. We'll just have coffee for now. Black, both of us. Danielle wrote it down, though she didn't need to. She hesitated for a second, debating whether to ask the usual follow-up question, cream or sugar, but the tone in Jonas's voice told her not to bother. As she turned away, she heard it again, his voice, in German, saying something that made the older man chuckle. Danielle's jaw tightened for a moment before she forced herself to keep walking. She'd learned long ago that you couldn't react to every comment. But this one was different. At the counter, she poured 2 black coffees into mugs, her mind turning over what she'd heard. The words weren't just dismissive, they were personal, and that wasn't going to sit right with her. She carried the mugs back to the table, setting them down gently. 2 black coffees, she said with a smile. Jonas gave a short nod, already reaching for his phone again. The older man thanked her, in English, and went back to his conversation. Danielle stepped away, but not far. She busied herself with wiping down the table next to them, close enough to catch more of their words without looking like she was listening. The more she heard, the more her curiosity shifted into something sharper. It wasn't just about her anymore. But if Jonas thought the language barrier gave him cover, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Danielle decided she wasn't going to let the comment slide, but she also wasn't going to rush it. Timing mattered. She'd learned that from her time overseas, in business meetings, in classrooms, even when haggling for fresh produce at street markets in Berlin. If you want the most impact, you wait until the other person feels comfortable, convinced they have the upper hand. She circled back to Jonas's table, a small notepad tucked in her apron pocket. This time, she stood just close enough to be a part of their space. I just wanted to let you know our kitchen has a couple of specials today, spinach and feta omelet, or the breakfast burrito if you're hungrier. Jonas glanced at her, almost impatient. The omelet, no onions, and bring it out quickly, please. He didn't look up again, just slid the menu toward her like it was an afterthought. The older man gave her a polite smile and said, I'll have the same. Thank you. His tone was warmer, but Danielle could tell who was leading the dynamic at this table. She wrote their orders down, then leaned slightly toward the older man. We'll have those out in about 10 minutes. Jonas's phone buzzed, and he picked it up immediately, switching back into German. Danielle didn't understand every phrase, but the tone was sharp, almost dismissive. She caught words like nobody and wasting time. He wasn't talking about his omelet. As she walked back to the counter, she passed by a regular, Mrs. Turner, who was waiting for her latte. You're running today, Mrs. Turner said, her voice warm. Danielle smiled. Just a little extra energy in the room, I guess. She handed her the latte and went into the kitchen to pass the orders along to Miguel, the cook. While the omelet sizzled on the grill, she replayed the fragments of Jonas's words in her head. The way he'd glanced at her earlier, like he was evaluating her against some invisible standard. The smug tone when he'd thought she couldn't understand. She wasn't angry, not exactly, more resolved. When the plates were ready, she carried them out, balancing the tray on one hand. She placed Jonas's omelet in front of him first, then the older man's. Let me know if you need anything else. Jonas didn't say thank you. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he took a sip of coffee and muttered something under his breath to the older man in German, something that made the older man's eyebrows raise briefly before he laughed again. Danielle turned away slowly, masking the fact that she'd heard every single word. Her German wasn't just conversational. It was precise. She knew exactly what Jonas had called her. Back behind the counter, she took a moment to breathe. It would be easy to throw his words back at him right now, in front of his companion, maybe even make a scene. But that wasn't the move. She wanted the moment to land hard, to be something he'd remember. So she waited. She poured another coffee for a customer at the end of the bar, straightened the stack of menus by the register, and kept one ear tuned to Jonas's table. The conversation had shifted back to business, but the arrogance in his voice hadn't dimmed. Danielle could feel the heat building in her chest. Not anger she couldn't control, but the kind you could channel. But she knew the best way to hit back was to let him believe, for just a little longer, that she was still in the dark. The cafe had thinned out a little. The older couple had left, the construction worker hadn't come back for his second coffee, and the students in the corner were too deep into their assignments to notice anything else. The room was quieter now, the clinking of silverware and low hum of the espresso machine the only background noise. Jonas leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the backrest. The older man had his fork halfway to his mouth when Jonas said something in German, his voice smooth but laced with derision. Danielle was only a few steps away, refilling the sugar jars. She caught the whole sentence clearly. Sie wirkt so, als ob sie froh wäre, überhaupt einen Job zu haben. Translation: she looks like she should just be grateful to have a job at all. Her fingers tightened around the glass sugar jar. She kept her back to them, pretending she hadn't heard. The older man chuckled. Not cruelly, but in that awkward way people laugh when they don't want to challenge the person sitting across from them. Jonas wasn't done. He followed up with, Man sieht ihr an, dass sie nicht viel von Bildung versteht. Translation: you can tell she's not someone who understands much about education. That one stung. Not because it was true, but because it was so confidently wrong. Danielle had a master's degree from Humboldt University in Berlin, one of the most prestigious in Germany. She'd worked on research projects, written academic papers in German, and navigated more complex conversations than Jonas could imagine, and yet here he was, reducing her to, what? A stereotype he carried around in his head? From the counter, she caught sight of Miguel peeking out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He gave her a curious look. He could tell something was off. Danielle shook her head subtly, signaling she had it handled. Jonas leaned forward now, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to keep her from hearing. He started talking numbers, amounts in the hundreds of thousands, and names of companies she didn't recognize. His tone shifted, almost smug. Then he said something that made her heart pick up. Es gibt sowieso niemanden hier, der das verstehen würde. There's no one here who would understand this anyway. Danielle set down the sugar jar with care, the glass clinking softly on the counter. She straightened, smoothed her apron, and walked toward their table. She could have just confronted him right then, but she wanted more. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing the exact moment when realization hit him. Everything good here? She asked in English, her voice calm, almost warm. Jonas didn't even glance at her. Fine. Then, in German, to the older man, Zumindest macht sie ihren Job. At least she's doing her job. Danielle smiled faintly. She nodded once, stepping away again, but inside her decision was made. She wasn't going to just respond. She was going to answer in the same flawless German he thought was his private little space. She waited until they were finishing their plates, until the coffee mugs were nearly empty. Then she walked back, collected the plates, and said in perfect, unbroken German, Es ist interessant, dass Sie über Bildung sprechen, Herr Wechsler, wenn Sie nicht einmal bemerken, wenn jemand jeden einzelnen Ihrer Sätze versteht. It's interesting you talk about education, Mr. Wechsler, when you don't even notice someone understanding every single sentence you've said. The fork in Jonas's hand paused midair. His eyes shot up to hers, blinking once like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. The older man froze, his gaze flicking between them. But Danielle wasn't about to stop with one sentence. She was just getting started. Jonas's fork hovered for a second before he set it down with a muted clink against the plate. He leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder to read, a mix of calculation and discomfort. Danielle didn't look away. Sie glauben, niemand hier versteht Sie, she continued in German, her tone steady but sharp. Aber ich habe jedes einzelne Wort gehört. Jedes. Von den Bemerkungen über mich bis zu den Dingen, die Sie wahrscheinlich nicht wollen, dass jemand anderes erfährt. You think no one here understands you, but I've heard every single word, every one, from the remarks about me to the things you probably wouldn't want anyone else to know. The older man cleared his throat, setting down his coffee mug. He looked at Jonas, clearly uneasy now. Jonas attempted a thin smile. Oh, so you speak German. How unexpected. He switched to English, as if hoping to wrestle back control of the conversation. But perhaps you misunderstood. No, Danielle cut in, still in German. I didn't misunderstand anything. I lived in Berlin for 3 years, studied there, worked there. My degree is from Humboldt University, so if you think your words are safe because they're not in English, you're wrong. There was a quiet in the cafe now. Not everyone was listening, but the tone of their voices had shifted enough that the air felt different. Miguel was leaning against the kitchen doorway again, arms crossed, pretending to be busy with a towel. Jonas's companion set his fork down. Jonas, he said quietly, in English this time, like a warning, but Jonas pressed on, his voice cooler now. And what exactly are you suggesting you heard? Danielle met his gaze evenly. Enough to know that you think I'm beneath you. Enough to know that you think I should be grateful just to have a job. And enough to hear you talk about amounts of money and names that sound like they'd be of interest to someone outside this cafe. Jonas's jaw moved slightly, a subtle shift that told her she'd landed the hit. He was measuring his next move, but Danielle wasn't finished. Do you know what the thing is about people you think aren't paying attention? She asked, switching briefly to English so every word was clear. They often notice more than you want them to. The older man leaned toward Jonas now, murmuring something too low for Danielle to catch. Jonas's eyes stayed on her, but his silence said plenty. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The steadiness of her tone was doing all the work. I've met people like you before, she said in German again. You walk into a place and think you can measure someone's worth in a glance. And sometimes you're right, but not today. There was no gloating in her voice, no smugness, just fact. Jonas finally looked away, picking up his coffee cup like he needed something to hold. Danielle knew she had him off balance, and part of her wanted to push harder, to bring up exactly which parts of his conversation had caught her attention. But she also knew when to leave a moment hanging. She stepped back from the table. Enjoy the rest of your coffee, gentlemen. Jonas didn't answer. The older man gave her a small nod, the kind that said he understood more than he let on. But Danielle had planted a seed, and she knew it would grow. Because now Jonas wasn't just worried about being embarrassed, he was wondering exactly how much she'd heard. Jonas tried to mask it, but Danielle could see the faint tightening around his mouth, the restless tapping of his fingers against the handle of his coffee mug. That calm, unshakable billionaire aura had slipped just enough for her to notice. The older man leaned closer to him, speaking in English now. You might want to lower your voice. Jonas shot him a look. It's fine, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He glanced around the cafe in a way he hadn't before, like he was suddenly aware there were other people in the room. 2 tables over, a middle-aged man with a tablet was pretending to read the news, but kept flicking his eyes toward Jonas. The college students were still typing, but Danielle knew better than to assume their earbuds meant they couldn't hear. Miguel hadn't gone back into the kitchen. Jonas took a deliberate sip of coffee and leaned back, affecting nonchalance. I think there's been some misunderstanding, he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for Danielle to hear from the counter. Waitresses, they hear things, but they don't always grasp context. It wasn't an apology, more like a lifeline he was throwing himself. Danielle walked back to his table, a calm expression masking the steady pulse in her chest. If you think context makes your words less insulting, Mr. Wexler, she said evenly, you might want to think about what that says. The tablet man stopped pretending entirely now, his eyes locked on the exchange. Jonas gave her a tight smile. I'm sure you're very good at your job. I didn't mean anything personal. She tilted her head slightly. You spoke about me in a language you thought I couldn't understand. That's personal, by definition. The older man sighed and rubbed his forehead. Jonas, maybe we should... But Jonas wasn't ready to give up. Look, you're clearly intelligent, and I appreciate that you've spent time abroad, but this is a misunderstanding that's growing into something bigger than it needs to be. Bigger than it needs to be? Danielle asked, her tone still controlled but sharper now. You're right about one thing. I did hear more than just your insults. I heard enough about financial transfers and company names to wonder why you were saying them in public. That landed. Jonas's gaze flickered for the briefest moment toward the man with the tablet, then to the college students in the back. The room felt smaller somehow. The sunlight from the window didn't seem to reach quite as far, the air thicker with the weight of something unspoken. Jonas lowered his voice, almost a whisper. Careful. Danielle took a step back, nodding once as if she'd just confirmed something to herself. You're right, she said. Careful is a good idea. She turned and walked away, but she didn't go far. Just back to the counter where she could still see their table. Jonas and the older man were speaking in quick, clipped sentences now. He looked unsettled, his hand running along his jaw, as if he could smooth out the tension. A part of Danielle wanted to stop here, to leave him with the discomfort of knowing his words hadn't gone unnoticed. But another part of her, the part that remembered every time someone had spoken over her, dismissed her, or assumed her ignorance, wanted to push just a little further. But before she decided how far to take it, Jonas made his next move. and it told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he really was. Jonas reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black card holder. He took his time flipping it open, sliding out one crisp business card between two fingers. The way he held it wasn't casual. It was deliberate, like he was presenting an escape route. He set it on the edge of the table nearest Danielle. "If you ever want a better job," he said, his voice smooth again, "call my assistant. I'm sure we can find something that better suits your talents." Danielle didn't touch the card. She looked at it for a moment, then back at him. "Is this supposed to be an apology?" "It's an opportunity," Jonas replied. "Sometimes it's better to move forward instead of dwelling on misunderstandings." She let out a quiet breath through her nose, not a laugh, but close. "You think you can insult someone, question their intelligence, and then make it disappear with a job offer? That's not moving forward. That's trying to bury it." The older man shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now. "Jonas, maybe we should let this go." Danielle rested her hands on the back of the chair across from them, her voice calm but steady. "Do you know why I came back from Berlin, Mr. Wexler? It wasn't because I couldn't make it there. I had a job, friends, a future. But my younger brother got sick. He needed someone to take care of him, someone to help pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. So I came back. I work double shifts here, not because I can't get anything better, but because it lets me be home when he needs me." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "So when you look at me and see someone you think should be grateful to have a job, you're missing everything that matters. And when you assume that because I'm a waitress, I don't understand you, you're not just wrong. You're showing the exact kind of arrogance that makes people stop trusting men like you." The room was quieter now than it had been all morning. Even the espresso machine had stopped hissing. Jonas glanced down at the untouched business card, then back up. For the first time since he'd walked in, he didn't have a ready answer. Danielle didn't wait for one. She picked up the business card, turned it over in her hand, and placed it face down on the table. "You can keep it," she said. "I think you're the one who needs the opportunity to actually listen to people you think are beneath you." Jonas's mouth pressed into a thin line. The older man gave Danielle another small nod, this time one of respect. She stepped back from the table, collected the empty plates, and carried them to the counter without looking over her shoulder. She didn't need to. The point had been made. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jonas slip the business card back into his holder, his expression unreadable now. He murmured something to the older man, who shook his head slightly. Danielle poured herself a glass of water, feeling the adrenaline slowly fade. She hadn't set out to make a scene today, but sometimes scenes make themselves when the truth finally gets a voice. And as Jonas stood to leave, his silence told her the message had landed, even if his pride wouldn't let him say it. Jonas left without another word. The little bell above the cafe door jingled as he stepped out into the Arizona sun, his companion following a few steps behind. Danielle watched through the window as the two men crossed the street and disappeared into a waiting black sedan. The cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The college students kept typing. Mrs. Turner came back for a second latte, and Miguel finally returned to the kitchen. But for Danielle, the air felt different, lighter somehow. She wasn't smiling for the sake of customer service now. She was smiling because she'd stood her ground. She went about wiping down tables, not because she had to, but because she wanted to keep moving, to let the moment settle in. She didn't know if Jonas would ever change the way he saw people. Maybe he'd tell himself she'd overreacted. Maybe he'd think about her words the next time he sat down in a restaurant. She couldn't control that. What she could control was the way she carried herself, and the reminder that her worth had nothing to do with the job title printed on a name tag. Before the lunch rush began, Danielle stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Across the street, life moved on. Cars passing, people chatting on the sidewalk, a bus pulling away from the curb. She thought about her brother at home, about the choices she'd made, and about how easily people like Jonas underestimated the people serving their coffee. She smiled to herself, not out of spite, but out of certainty. He'd remember her. Not because she'd embarrassed him, but because she'd reminded him, and maybe everyone else within earshot, that respect isn't optional. So here's the takeaway. It doesn't matter if you're in a boardroom or behind a counter. The way you treat people says more about you than any language, any title, or any amount of money ever could. And if someone writes you off based on what they think they see, let them talk. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show them, in their own words, just how wrong they are. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, and if they try, be ready to speak up in whatever language they least expect.